In the world of anime, there are fewer names that are as well known, regarded, or respected than the name Hayao Miyazaki. Co-founder of Studio Ghibli, he's been making anime masterpieces for the silver screen for as long as I've been alive, and is always well known for not only the themes of his films, but the consistency of them, almost always turning out works that have provided the viewers to think, reflect, and often find themselves within the very characters that they're watching. The artistry that he's put into the world of film is unlike many others, and we're going to be talking about what many consider to be his masterpiece work as we celebrate the 20th year anniversary of Spirited Away. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am your ever-friendly Pokeprof, and welcome back to Fascinating Fiction. So, I'll be entirely honest, when I was first thinking about doing a film by Miyazaki for this episode, I was originally considering to do the movie that first introduced me to his works, Princess Mononoke. Not only do I consider it to be one of the best films he's ever done, but if it wasn't for that particular movie, I would have never gotten into anime as a whole like I did. My exposure would have been limited to the likes of Pokemon and Dragon Ball Z. But as much as I love The Princess of the Wolves, I can't deny the fact that Spirited Away is just a flat-out bigger film in how much impact it had, as well as the fact that this week was when it first came out into theaters 20 years ago. Well, here in the States, it actually premiered in Japan back in 2001, but this was a really big film for the United States too, so I wanted to make special mention of it here. Looking at just what made the film so great, we first gotta delve into the story itself, and like many of Miyazaki's works, it starts from such a simple beginning. We join up with a young girl named Chihiro who comes to a new town with her parents. We see from the start that she's a bit childish, complaining about the fact that they had to move and that the first time she got a bouquet of flowers, it was as a going away present. After a wrong turn leads them off the beaten path, Chihiro's parents decide to explore the area instead of turning around, Chihiro herself being reluctant, afraid, and uncomfortable to follow at first, eventually clinging to her mother once they start going into the long tunnel. I'm actually going to make special mention of this tunnel right now, because not only does it have a bit of significance in the story that we'll see later, but I'm also wanting to point out something that I see related to it when we get to that point. Eventually, we get into what the father describes as an old theme park, something that at one point in time had been built everywhere throughout the area. Smelling some food coming from one of the stalls and realizing that every stall they passed were restaurants, the parents decide to help themselves to the food, reasoning that they'll pay afterwards. Chihiro refuses, afraid that they'll get in trouble, and instead ignores her parents as they start wolfing down the food. Roaming about the theme park, our main character eventually stumbles on what she describes as a bathhouse, which, especially for American audiences back in the day, was kinda needed to know since a public place to bathe isn't something that people are familiar with even today. It's after that we get introduced to a young boy whose name we later learn is Haku, who tries to get Chihiro to get out of the area before the sun goes down, though the lights of the park are already being lit even as he says this. Running back to her parents, Chihiro finds that the two of them have been turned into pigs, only the slightest bit of humanity left in them being their clothes and a bit of their hair. Being the young girl that she is, Chihiro freaks out and tries to escape from the park only to find that the bare field they had crossed before has now become overflowing with a sea of water. Yeah, if it isn't obvious at this point, we kinda left the real world now and have entered a realm of fantasy, which is actually kind of interesting for Miyazaki at this point of his career. In a lot of his works up to now, there was usually a pretty strong marriage between the fantasy worlds he created and the real worlds that the stories were taking place in. Things like Princess Mononoke, Castle in the Sky, and Kiki's Delivery Service were all movies that treated things like magic, gods, and the supernatural as something that exists alongside the real world, and normal humans were aware of it. Spirited Away doesn't do that, instead having that barrier that Chihiro has now crossed over into, leaving her within the realm of spirits. Knowing a human would otherwise be in danger here, Haku helps Chihiro and we get introduced to a number of characters that we'll be with for the rest of the film. Kamaji the Boiler Man, Lin the Worker, and eventually Yubaba, the witch who runs the bathhouse. It's only through constantly asking for work and the fact that Yubaba took an oath to give a job to anyone who asks, that Chihiro is able to stay in the bathhouse and not be turned into a pig like her parents. This is about where we hit the core of the film and the most important part of it. Chihiro, now renamed Sen through Yubaba stealing part of her name, learns how to work within the land of the spirits, who don't care about her age when it comes to expecting her to do her part. She's discriminated against thanks to her being a human, and the only ones who show any concern or care for her at the beginning are Kamaji, Lin, and Haku, the latter of which she learns is also a dragon. Though she's not the best worker, she tries her best, slowly but surely getting better. And that's one of the major focuses of the film here, Chihiro's growth as a person. When we started out the film, she was as childish as a girl her age could be. But it's as she works and deals with this frightening world of spirits that she becomes more mature, more willing to help others. This is also seen in how she works hard to help out the stink spirit when he's needing a bath. We'll actually be talking more about that stink spirit here in a little bit when we get to the background of the movie, but for now just know that after being cleaned, the spirit gave Chihiro some medicine. Originally wanting to give said medicine to her parents in hope of returning them from being pigs, Chihiro instead decides to use half of it on Haku after finding him injured after stealing from Zeniba, Yubaba's twin sister. This is also while dealing with Yubaba's giant baby. Yes, you heard and see that right. Yubaba's giant baby. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of Japanese yokai spirits and a demon or two, so this shouldn't be too crazy, especially when Zeniba turns him into a mouse. It's at this point that a character we've been seeing throughout the film, No-Face, really gets to be the next big problem that Chihiro has to deal with, especially as she's the one who caused him to be the problem in the first place. No-Face in particular is one of those big fan favorite characters of the film, having no personality himself, but being influenced by the choice and actions of others. Initially calm and peaceful, it's the greed and rudeness of the workers in the bathhouse that eventually turn him into a monster, only wanting to spend time with Chihiro thanks to her being nice to him from the start. Between dealing with No-Face and wanting to help Haku by returning what he stole, Chihiro eventually makes her way towards Zeniba. This is actually where we get some rather quiet scenes of the characters riding on the train before arriving at Swamp Bottom, the home of Zeniba. Turns out she's a much kinder character than her sister, letting Chihiro rest and relax while she and the friends that Chihiro had made at this point make her a special hair tie. She also encourages Chihiro to remember, as at this point it's become obvious that there's some kind of special connection between the little girl and Haku that she has forgotten. Turns out what Chihiro forgot was a memory that we've been seeing flashes of throughout the film involving Haku. Like Chihiro herself, he too had traded his name to Yubaba and had long since forgotten the original one entirely, binding him to her completely. It was then that Chihiro says that she recalls a memory of a river that, instead of drowning her when she fell in, gently washed her to a shore. She thinks that Haku is that river, calling him by his name, the Kohaku River. So this is where I've got to mention one of the common elements in Miyazaki's work that most people are aware of at this time, and how they're strangely subtle here. The state of nature is something that is usually a big element in a lot of Ghibli films, about how it's being treated, about what's being done to it, and how it seems like nothing can be done to save it at times. In a film like Princess Mononoke, one of the core elements is nature fighting back, wanting to regain what they've lost because of human progression. Other films like Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind are also more advert, with nature also being something that the main characters are having to deal with. Spirited Away does not have these same overtones, instead with us only ever seeing it through the stink spirit from before and Haku. In the case of the sting spirit, it's actually a river spirit who has been turned into what he is by pollution, as we've seen by the fact that a bicycle and other garbage is pulled out of his body. Haku's the other case, as the original Kohaku River had been paved away for apartments, leaving the spirit of the river without a home. It's actually kind of interesting how quiet the aspect of nature being abused is within this film, while at the same time showing more directly what's happening to the two characters we see representing these spirits of rivers actually being affected by human actions. As Haku and Chihiro return to the bathhouse, we find Yubaba, ready to give the girl one last challenge before letting her go free, doing so thanks to Haku striking a deal with her. If she can tell which of the pigs before her is her parents, both they and Chihiro are free to leave. It's when Chihiro confusedly says that none of them are her parents does her contract with Yubaba break, granting her her freedom while the entire bathhouse cheers for the girl, having to come to care for her. The final word she shares with Haku, whom she's grown to care deeply for in this time, is to not to look back, to continue on until she gets past the tunnel once more. And though she hesitates for a few moments, clearly wanting to look back at her friends, those who have come to care for her, she pushes on regardless, ready to move into her new home. If it's not been noticeable by the things I've said about this film thus far in describing it, Spirited Away is a movie about Chihiro growing up, about being able to move on with her life when change happens. More so than anything else in this film, Chihiro is having to get used to change. The change of her parents into pigs, of her name changing to Sen, how No-Face changes upon entering the bathhouse, and how the workers of the bathhouse change in relation to Chihiro herself. And Chihiro changes upon the end of the film, no longer being the reluctant child she was at the start of it. Change is at the center of the movie, and how while some of it can be good and some of it can be bad, it's up to those going through the change to adapt to it the best they can, to push forward and not be held back by wanting things to stay the same. There's also themes in this movie that relate Spirited Away to a few other sources. In particular, that tunnel I'd say we get back to? Imagine for a moment if instead of that, we had a mirror. Or perhaps, for those of you who are more familiar with the Disney stock of things, a rabbit hole? I bet some of you have made the connection now to a very similar story about a young girl named Alice and her own adventures in relation to Chihiro here, both characters stumbling into a world of wonder, of rules and events that are new to them and having to adapt to the way things are. While not exactly a one-to-one comparison, there has been some acknowledgement that Wonderland did help inspire some of the elements within the movie, with Yubaba having many similarities with the Duchess, such as their large heads, massive babies, and rather aggressive natures. When it comes to the background of the film, there's a lot to go into it. Too much, honestly, to say that much in this video in all one go. But to cover some of the bigger things, originally Miyazaki wasn't going to create this movie at all. In fact, he had actually retired after Princess Mononoke and only had come back out of retirement after the passing of his successor, Yoshifumi Kondo. He would then proceed to retire and come back out of retirement quite a number of more times since then, with him actually returning to making movies once again with the upcoming movie known as How Do You Live? Other interesting tidbits about this movie include things like Chihiro being based off the then 10-year-old daughter of one of Miyazaki's closest friends, the fact that the themes of wanting to return to an older time for Japan when the country seemed to be going through a lot of troubles was the core to this film, and even the closing song known as Always With Me is in part responsible for the actual existence of the film. Perhaps one of the biggest impacts of this film, as a final note before we end today's episode, is the impact it had not only in Japan, but also the USA. In its native country, Spirited Away was the highest grossing movie of all time since its release up until the year 2020. That's right, this movie was the biggest blockbuster Japan had seen for 19 years. And if that isn't amazing enough, here in the US, It won the Academy Award for the Best Animated Feature in the 75th Academy Awards. You want to know how big that is? Let me put it this way. To date, Spirited Away is the only hand-drawn and foreign language film to actually win the reward since its creation, with everything else being computer animated. So yeah, it was well talked about and known even for those who had never heard about anime at the time. There are very few films like Spirited Away. In some parts, it feels like such a quiet, small, and intimate movie about a young girl being thrown into a weird world. And in other parts, it's so massive that I feel like I've not done it any justice by talking about it on the show. The adventure isn't a high-flying, in-your-face battle like some other films have been, nor does it have the big bombastic endings like others do either. Unlike so many other things in our lives, Spirited Away is a film about the journey, the travel from one place to another, and the changes we make along the way. It's about the growth of one young girl learning to be more than what she was before, to adapt and grow in a way that, like the movie itself, is subtle but powerful in its result. It's something that just about everyone can get something different out of in terms of themes, importance, and what they learned from it. And I feel like that's a sign of a truly great film. With all that said, I hope I've done a good job to entertain you, and I'll do my best to do so again in the future. Hopefully you'll follow along with my content by subscribing and doing all those other things that give us YouTubers life. If you wish to support me a bit more, I do have a Patreon where you can get access to bonus content. But until next time, stay frosty.